Welcome back to another edition of the Samsara Report. We're stoked to get together again to record, and this time we had a bit of a discussion around what it is that we wanted to discuss in this podcast, and I think you had a good idea in terms of something that's kind of come into your consciousness and into your mind these days.
Yeah. So it was a book that we had initially read in my cultural psychology class. It's called The Righteous Mind. It's by Jonathan Haidt, and it's a good book in general, but I think the concepts that he outlines in the book are especially useful when we're noticing as much political upheaval as we are. I mean, that's been the case for the last 200 years, at least. But I think especially now. And there's a couple of reasons for this, but I thought it would be worthwhile to sort of discuss some of the concepts in the book. And because you've yet to read it, I thought it would be interesting to see how you respond and how your curiosity reacts in real time to the topics. And then I thought we could do a little bit of speculating about what sort of cognition you might expect in something in like enlightenment. Obviously, highly subjective, highly speculative topics, but I thought it would just be fun to sort of get our thoughts out because, as we talked about just before hitting record, Sikhism does a fair bit of description on the sorts of expectations one might have for their own process in moving towards enlightenment.
Yeah.
The dropping of the ego, well, not the dropping, that's the last step as you mentioned, but just the recognition that we act out of ego unless we start to inject more and more awareness into our behavior, into our functioning of our mind. And we'll get into that a little bit, but maybe I'll just do a bit of a description as to why I think it's worth talking about. Because when I actually started in university, I started studying political science. And I started in political science because I wanted to solve and I wanted to understand what were some of the biggest, most challenging issues that we had. And I thought politicians were a pretty good place to start.
Definitely.
But it's gotten a lot more complicated because, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn puts it, the line between good and evil is drawn down every human heart, right? Because, in other books and other studies looking at things like the banality of evil, it's really easy for many of us to find ourselves in very morally precarious circumstances. And that is like, actually, as Jonathan Haidt puts it in his book, we don't usually update our moral reasoning easily, but there are some examples of this. One is when we actually engage with a topic in our own private meditation and we adopt a different orientation towards it. The others are when we feel ourselves to be socially influenced. So we don't even necessarily have to follow the thinking. We just know what other people are doing.
Yeah.
And just by dint of being as socially connected as we are, we the reason why we've gotten to this stage in our development is because we can cooperate so well, but that's also because we can tune into others. And that's how you get things like genocidal action during the Holocaust, because people go along to get along primarily.
Definitely.
So there's a real horror to that, and especially recognizing that unless we ourselves do enough of our own meditation and our own development, we're just as susceptible to fall into that kind of pressure.
Yeah.
Which is a horrifying thought, because there's real obvious risks associated with that, but then there's also some very subtle ones too. But I thought it's worth looking at things like moral psychology, because when you see the way we behave and the way we interact now with one another, especially with social media, heightening the kind of divide that we're experiencing between left and right political, conservative versus liberal, or Democrat versus
Conservative.
right. Well, there's conservative,
Republican.
and then there's right Republican,
Yeah.
and then Democrat, and then Canadian, obviously liberal versus conservative.
Yeah.
Not the same thing exactly, but anyways, the way we interact in that instance, it's always getting me to wonder, like, if we were to be sophisticated about this, how would we actually solve this problem?
Yeah.
Because very clearly, in every instance where you watch like a Jubilee YouTube episode where people are just roundtable attacking a single person holding a different view, or even some debates on some of the major platforms where there's just ad hominem after ad hominem attack,
Yeah.
insulting somebody's character as opposed to going after the idea and trying to disassemble it.
Yeah. Looking for straw man.
Right, right. It doesn't actually advance the discussion at all. People
Definitely.
just feel the need to dig themselves further into this. And so when I try to figure out how do you go about this in a more sophisticated way, I start to look at things like Jonathan Haidt's work and understanding ourselves as moral animals. And the way he basically opens the book is in developmental psychology and understanding how and why we arrive at moral intuitions about behavior in the first place.
Yeah.
And regardless of whether you're from an individualistic culture like those of us in the West, or you're from a sociocentric culture or a more collectivist culture like those in the East, they typically all involve some relationship to harm to people. All of our moral intuitions really relate to these, but there's some exceptions to that. And then we start getting into things like disgust and so on. But the discussion, the debate that he opens with around those kind of moral intuitions in development is how do we develop them? Because we don't seem to just adopt them by rote, by watching adults and then copying their notions about things.
Yeah.
We seem to arrive independently, but it doesn't seem to be entirely innate either. It's not entirely nature and it's not entirely nurture. So essentially what he describes is we do have an innate sense in some regard, but that it's translated through our culture how we actually express our moral intuitions,
Yeah.
which is why you start to see differences between things like individual cultures versus sociocentric cultures. They don't have the same moral intuitions about the same things because the individual can be subservient to the well-being of the group in a sociocentric culture, but the individualistic cultures prioritize this above all because they're like an axiom to the whole.
Yeah.
But the reason we continue to butt heads when you get to being adults is because, in essence, the way he describes our functioning is the majority of the brain, that is, you have the prefrontal cortex, which is like the new cortex. It's the most recent aspect of the brain. And then you have the older parts of the brain, which essentially make up your emotional, your intuitive reasoning.
Yeah.
There's a lot of utility to that, so he very carefully distinguishes these parts of the brain. Not to say that your emotions are dumb and that they don't actually have the ability to serve you. They need to be overridden or checked carefully. He makes very clear that your intuitive parts of the brain have very good reasons to be what they are. Essentially, those were the parts that were the most, they evolved the longest. So if you imagine us evolving from an earlier state to this particular point, those were the parts of the brain that were responsible for mitigating all of the threats, for developing our ability to understand our environment, to be as flexible and plastic as we are, to manage all of the threats because they're so varied. It's the parts of our brain that help us to be able to react immediately without having to think through these things. The example being, if you encounter a stick in the road, or rather you encounter a snake, regardless of whether you can actually physically perceive it as a stick initially, your body will respond as though it's a threat before you can consciously realize this.
Yeah.
And that's because threats don't give you enough time. So there's parts of they don't give you enough time to consciously react to them. So this intuitive, reactive part is very useful for those reasons. And because the prefrontal cortex evolved later, his description is that it evolved to serve this other component.
If I could just
Yeah,
interject for a
by all
second,
means.
I think it is important to kind of give a little bit of context to when you say that it's a recent development, the
Mm-hmm.
prefrontal cortex. Some of the recent findings that they've had have kind of implied that anatomically identical Homo sapiens humans
Mm-hmm.
have been around for about 500,000 years from recent skulls that they
Right,
found,
right.
right? And so
When I
these
say recent, yeah,
compared to the overall evolution,
right.
but still there's been, from what they've seen and what these recent kind of findings have found, there's still been about 500,000 years of time since the development of the prefrontal cortex,
Mm-hmm.
which obviously the expansion of gray matter and the prefrontal cortex is something that science still struggles to understand how it happened in such a short period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where these kind of alternative fringe theories come out for how that was possible.
Mm.
But yeah, it's recent when you look at the development, the
Right,
overall
when we're
development.
talking about a time scale of millions of years.
Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. No, that's a really good point too.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think one of the things to add to that that's useful is just the recognition of the kind of budgeting that seems to be going on at a biological level. So, at least as far as we can tell, biology doesn't typically invest in something as I mean, I'm using terms that are obviously, I'm heavily anthropomorphizing this process, but the way organisms seem to evolve, there doesn't seem to be much in the way of like a frivolous evolution. There are mutations, there are evolutionary jumps into certain formations of different tissue, different functional parts of the body, or software updates. Let's call them that. And if those don't cut it, if they don't actually help the being to survive and to reproduce, they don't make it. So there's a very fierce calculation that's taking place. So
Yeah.
the body, the human body, the human mind, it's subject to the same pressures to evolve and develop things that have real utility,
Yeah.
that have to show themselves to be useful
Mm-hmm.
within the lifespan of that individual. So, in that sense, these parts of the body, the parts of the mind, they follow the same pattern. The description he gives is sort of like the elephant and the rider. And he talks about why he thinks it's an elephant as opposed to a horse. He says, A, the elephant's bigger. It's a lot smarter than a horse. And so the rider has a lot less of an ability to actually control. What the elephant needs from the rider, though, is that because the rider is capable of seeing further, so his example is like it can run simulations and imagine things.
Yeah.
It can also use language differently, so it can act like a spokesperson for the elephant. It's effectively a full-time PR firm for the elephant, is his description of it.
Wow.
So, and we notice this when we move around in terms of like our moral reasoning on things. We typically feel something, and then we'll find a rationalization afterwards. And it's not necessary that you be conscious of this process. In fact, most of the time, we aren't. Which is why we see people butting heads when it seems like they have much more in common than they do differences. America, as an example, like there's many issues that there's bipartisan agreement on.
Yeah.
Everybody wants functional healthcare. That's a really, really obvious piece. But when you watch people discuss it, you see them butting heads about things that might seem arbitrary. The kind of ways to pay for this thing.
Yeah.
That's where you start to see this clash occurring internally for people. That there's moral intuitions that are then being translated through this prefrontal cortex that match what this older part of the brain is responding to, is intuiting rather. So it's really challenging, and his description of that then leads him to say, if you actually want to get somewhere with people, you need to appeal to the elephant. You need to actually identify the components of intuition underlying it, the emotional part of it, essentially. And that's the other component of the arriving at different thinking around moral issues because they're so deeply held. Even if you can't justify them somehow, you'll still find a way to hold on to them. So, I mean, we can discuss what he calls harmless taboo violations. But the other moment where you actually arrive at a different opinion about something, if you haven't meditated on it and come to the conclusion yourself, or you're not just responding to social pressures, is if you have a conversation with a good friend that can help you to see things in a different light. And there's a couple of different reasons why that is the case, one of which is that you presumably believe that this person is your best interest at heart. And I remember you and I actually had one of these conversations after I became a vegetarian. You and I had actually sat down in a McDonald's of all places, I think. We were just grabbing a coffee or something. You were telling me about the evidence now that's been gathered to show that plants can feel pain.
Yeah.
And that wasn't something that was on the top of my mind because I had already become a vegetarian, and it's not like I was riding on like moral superiority as a result, but like I wasn't ready to fully concede that this big decision that I'd made was essentially all for naught because it was intended to try and reduce suffering. And it was part of a bigger idea that as a result of being alive, unless you're following Jainism, for example, and you're willing to only eat fruit, and as far as we know, fruit doesn't feel pain, but maybe one day we'll find out that it does, then you will be causing suffering because that's the cost of being alive.
Yeah.
So you had been able to do that for me because you're a friend of mine, and I can tell that you weren't doing it out of malice. And it was something that I was willing to take on and consider, even as it had major implications for the way that I lived my life.
And I gotta say that the point of that conversation wasn't to sway you either way. And often when I have this conversation with my parents too,
Right.
we grew up in a household where it was kind of considered morally superior to be a vegetarian. And even within Guru Granth Sahib Ji, within the scriptures and Sikhism, this conversation is actually like kind of cited how Brahmins often think of themselves as spiritually and morally superior because they have a Vaishnu or a vegetarian lifestyle.
Right.
And in the scriptures it's mentioned that there is flesh within so many aspects of our life. Flesh is is part of the process of birth, and it's part of there's different religions that as part of their sacrament or as part of their religious practices they do consume meat, or they consume flesh in different ways.
Right.
And so the notion that's being kind of highlighted in those lines is don't apply yourself this moral superiority just based on the fact that you're vegetarian. Like, it's more complex than that.
Yes.
It's not, the point of that is not to say go and eat meat, right? But it's to kind of show people that this conversation is more complex.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where I was approaching it with you, and when I do with my parents is, we shouldn't look down on others who make the choice to be non-vegetarian or who, go and do something like hunting or whatever it is, before we actually look at the complexity of this conversation, right? So it's tough when you try to kind of breach this subject with somebody who has been entrenched in that psychology or in that thinking for so much of their life.
Yeah.
And so that day I was kind of bringing up a few points about, they ended up essentially seeing that, with humans, if you give humans ether, you actually target the central nervous system, and it's a type of it's a type of
Are you talking about like
anesthesia.
literal ether? Yeah.
Yeah, so
Right.
it's a type of anesthesia that would actually prevent your central nervous system from operating in the same way. And so the experiment basically was seeking to see what type of similarities there are in different plants. And what they ended up finding was, if you give these plants, certain plants which are called, like in India we call them touch-me-nots, and
I
they're
know
essentially
these. Yeah, they're called the shy leaves in Kenya.
Yeah, so you poke it, you touch it, and the leaves kind of close, right? And so they wanted to see, if you give ether to these plants, if it actually inhibits their ability to close or anything like that. Because the fact that they close based on touch, it kind of signified that there was some type of, touch response, feeling response that's there. And so when they gave this plant ether, they noticed that when they would poke it, it would not actually close in the same way.
Wow.
And so what that implied is that they actually have a working nervous system that can be potentially in some ways similar to ours.
Right.
And
Right.
so, plants have like potentially a spectrum of pain threshold also. And so then they, recent studies showed that plants also scream when they're being
Carrots.
pruned,
Yeah.
right?
It's not within the audible range that we can hear, but apparently carrots can scream among many other plants.
And that was something that I got thinking on when I used to read Harry Potter and watch the movies. Mandrakes, essentially, you pull them out
Yeah.
and they're like this root vegetable and they're screaming,
Yeah.
right? And so I was imagining how our response to, vegetarian versus carnivore or omnivore diets would be
Yeah.
if we could see the pain that we actually, thrust onto animal or onto plants.
That's
right?
very interesting. You probably see comparable burnout rates to in like greenhouse workers as opposed to like people that work in slaughterhouses.
Yeah.
But right, and it's interesting that you mentioned that, and I'm curious when you have conversations with your parents about this, because that's a whole other level. And just like you had the conversation with me, can you say a little bit more about your intuitions when starting that conversation?
So it's just like I grew up in that household where I had that same philosophy kind of in my head based on them projecting it there, which is that if individuals eat meat, it was kind of disgusting,
Right.
and it was like just morally and ethically wrong. And so when we would be having a conversation with somebody around our parents, and they would mention like, oh yeah, and then the other day I went to go grab some chicken from the grocery store or anything like that, or I was cooking some eggs. My parents would have like a visual response to actually hearing that type of stuff, and we would often mirror it. Like we would be disgusted or whatever,
Right.
and then it kind of made its way into our sensory response.
Yeah.
That when we would smell chicken somewhere at like a wedding reception or at somebody's house that they're cooking it, we would be disgusted by it, and it would be this kind of weird kind of response. And so the conversation with my parents was kind of to outline the fact that, people from all different cultures have different practices. And if you are somebody like the Inuit people,
Right.
you don't have access to plants as much. You don't have access to, organized agriculture. And so they really rely on essentially seal blubber. And you would see, videos of families eating raw seal blubber, and that's one of the main components of their diet.
Yeah.
Right. So are they morally and ethically inferior, and are they like to be faulted for the access to food, the only access to food that they have? And at one point my parents might have essentially pushed back and said, they have the prerogative or the ability to actually move out of that area. But that's just oversimplifying a lot of, obviously.
They could just move.
Yeah, obviously these are not individuals that have that all have that ability, right? And so,
Right.
yeah, the conversation is just like, even in the scriptures, it's like, do not waste your breath on these conversations of moral and ethical superiority based on an individual's diet. Look rather into the other actions that
Right.
an individual, does in their day to day.
Right.
You can be somebody who's vegetarian, but cheats people financially.
Right.
And, is somebody who's kind of conducting an infidelity or is just kind of doing all these different actions that can be considered to be.
It's very much the don't be concerned about the speck in your brother's eye. There's a log stuck in your. That's a very funny. I would really want to read the actual literal
Quote.
translation of that, because like there's a log in your eye, dude. What? But yeah, I think I appreciate you sharing that, because it illustrates several things to me. One is, as Haidt described, that our moral intuitions to some extent are innate, but they are also culturally translated as we develop. According to the kind of reasoning that we can do. And he has a funny description of like the stages of which, like there is a point at which when you're a very, very young child, just as like between, I think it's something like between 2 and 5, you don't have the ability to intuit that water in a wide glass is the same amount as when poured into a tall glass. You assume that there's more in the tall glass by dint of it being taller, for example. And you're a lot more... You're a little more simplified in your reasoning about decision makings. Like something can be bad just because adults say it's bad,
Yeah.
versus when you get to between like the 5 and 7, 5, 13 range. He calls that the age of petty moralism. That's the kind of age where you're like, stop and quit hitting yourself. I'm not hitting you. I'm hitting you with your own hand. It's okay. It's kind of that age where you're starting to kind of figure out the rules. You're not very sophisticated yet, but so as you develop, it becomes a little more and more sophisticated, and obviously your brain comes online. 90% of your brain is there by the time you're 6 years old, and then it's kind of a refining and pruning period beyond that. And then roughly when you're about 25, say, depending on the gender or the sex rather, you start to come online fully, is what they say now.
Yeah.
Then it's kind of very, very carefully instantiated into the culture. But the other component to that was the intuition I'm hearing in the way you engage your parents, is in starting with the kind of deeper emotional component to things, which is like, just as we take our experience for granted, there are people living in ways that they take for granted
Yeah.
as being, well, either like good or at least morally innocuous.
Natural.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And I think that's when I look at the way we relate to one another, and when I see people, for example, attacking like the word conservative in some circles is now a pejorative.
Yeah.
Like full shutdown of the discussion. But then I've also got this thought of like, well, if you think they're stupid, if you think liberals are stupid, if you think conservatives are stupid, to me, I'm curious as to why your initial impulse isn't like, these poor bastards, like how could they know otherwise? They're being fed misinformation such that they're not arriving at the conclusion I've drawn. But rather, it's not that. It's not like compassion for the people that have not been given the correct information,
Yeah.
according to your purview. It's like, look at these idiots. It's getting closer to the disgust circuit, or they're just bad. And then I wonder too if a lot of that is the result of Haidt doesn't go into this so much. This is my own personal speculation. But how much do many of us feel like we need a villain in our life? How much heavy lifting does that do for us to explain why our lives are not ideal?
Yeah. It comes to that victim mentality also, right?
Right.
And just kind of being able to justify your own ability to move forward at the speed or the kind of ability that you feel that you should.
Right.
But
Right.
yeah, it's like, it is tough when you try to kind of breach these subjects with individuals that are really locked into political views. You try to kind of have them branch out, and it's like you said, we're absorbing a lot of information when we're at a young age. We're sponges, and so it's pretty intense how much of your thinking gets locked in at a very young age.
Right.
Especially if you don't check it. And I think they said that when it comes to human biology, you get about, it's obviously a general and probably not completely accurate, but they're saying that you get about 70% of how you look from your parents and about 80% of how you think, right? So your ability to reason, your ability to kind of think outside of the box.
Yeah. What's the other 30% for looks?
So
your decisions?
And just environmental conditions and stuff, right? Like the type of food that you take in, the quality of the water that you're taking
it's
in.
A crazy amount of variability.
Yeah, and so we imagine that it's a huge amount of variability from these external factors, but the point of like that is to say that a lot of it is actually influenced already before you even enter the picture, right?
Right. But there are some interesting like intuitions that you can have that are seemingly independent of that, like when you're very young. And I mean, there's many instances where, like, before kids understand that you just ignore homelessness, for example, like you'll see them go like, "Is he okay?"
Yeah.
They'll respond.
Yeah.
I remember a story too of my cousin. My family was setting up for an event or something, and my aunt was moving like a big pot off of the patio or something, and there were all these little pill bugs underneath.
Yeah.
Like roly-polies. Everyone calls them roly-polies. And she started stamping on them. And my little cousin, he must have been like 2 or 3. he went like, they deserve to live just like we do. Like, he wasn't taking any like notes from the adults as to what was right or wrong. He morally intuited on his own that
Yeah.
it was wrong to kill these things. It was very, very interesting. And I'm sure like as life changed, like he probably adopted different ideas maybe. I
Yeah.
don't think he's out there like hurting small animals. He's a sweet guy. But it's still interesting to me that strange dichotomy, nature versus nurture.
Definitely. And when we're looking at human psychology and, human morality,
Mm-hmm.
the fact that we end up looking to the animal kingdom a lot of times
Mm-hmm.
is something that has always kind of given me pause. The fact that, Jane Goodall, she was studying chimps, I believe it was,
Yep.
and she was looking at, their behaviors. And she initially, from what I've heard, she was very hesitant to publish her findings
Yes.
because she saw that they had savage behavior. They would murder other chimps. They would essentially take part in cannibalistic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They would have wars that would last decades.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so,
Seemingly unnecessary, the degree to which they would target and antagonize.
yeah, and we often attribute a lot of these type of traits or these behaviors
Mm-hmm.
to humans having like this higher level of consciousness through the prefrontal cortex
Right.
and our abilities to kind of uh, um, think from a higher level. But
Mm-hmm.
seeing this mimicked in the animal kingdom or in the mammalian kingdom,
Right.
it gives you pause, right?
Yeah, and in some degree, in some sense, it should because, as I mentioned at the outset, for the most part, the prefrontal cortex, for many of us, it seems, is used to justify what the rest of the brain arrives at intuitively.
Yeah.
And interestingly, as Haidt notes in his book, the rider doesn't know what the elephant is thinking, which is why it's great at coming up with reasons why it makes the decisions that it makes, justifying where it wants to go or making sense of why it went where it went after the fact. But there's a bit of a disconnect there, and
Yeah.
essentially, I think you can notice this on an experiential level by recognizing we can't tap into our unconscious easily.
Yeah.
You can see some evidence of it here and there. You can glimpse it maybe through dreams, or you can watch your brain sometimes when you make a decision, and then you watch your brain rationalize why you did what you did after the fact, which is always a bit of a weird thing.
Yeah.
But it's not easy to observe directly. And I just wanted to return quickly for that reason in going towards having the discussions that we do, how you actually have really tricky conversations with people. Because I was always looking for something that's like actionable, actual pragmatic advice I can take from this.
Mm-hmm.
And one of these is similar to the way you describe having these conversations with your parents. Like you started the conversation on something that's a lot closer to home, a lot more of an intuitive level. You didn't start by shaming them. You didn't start by beating them over the head with facts. That would not work with people.
Initially, I did. And
Right,
then,
you tried that. Yeah.
And then, just being immature, but
Mhm.
you learn quickly that doesn't work.
No. And you know that for a lot of reasons. A, it doesn't work outside, but you've never been convinced of this either
Yeah.
through that method.
Yeah.
The only times that you've ever changed it is when somebody has appealed to you first on an emotional level. They've
Mhm.
recognized that even if they don't see it the way you see it, that being a valid human being, somebody who's thinking, even if you don't personally understand why, like my assumption now is when I start talking with people is that we want the same things fundamentally. You want to feel safe. You want to be able to maximize your effect on a situation and minimize its effect on you. You want to get your basic needs met, shelter, food, etc. How that translates in the world, that's where we start to have discussions around right or wrong.
Yeah.
But you fundamentally want the same things as me. And I start with that. How it translates into why you think that means shutting the borders down or opening the borders up.
Yeah.
Now, like, we'll start to talk about how we've gotten to that place. But just starting from that position, that's the only entry point I've found that allows me to have conversations. And I do frequently. I had a university club I started called the Sense Making Cafe.
Yeah.
And it was essentially about this. How do we interface really challenging conversations starting from very different beginnings?
Yeah.
And it's like we all, like you, I never found any success in starting with facts. It had to be by appealing to people on an emotional level and giving them the benefit of the doubt. Any other method, and this is why I bristle at things like generalizations, especially when it comes to people.
Mm-hmm.
Like they do this, even when it's someone like groups like politicians.
Yeah.
I know it's easy to do that, right? I know it's easy to do that,
Yeah.
but unless you're actually willing to go, that could be me in another life, you're never going to actually open things up and allow politicians who probably some of them know they've done the wrong thing,
Yeah.
even if it's for years, and allow them to kind of move closer to like, you know what, I really dropped the ball.
Yeah.
You're going to have them dig their heels in further.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to get what we have right now, which is, well, it's a pretty fraught environment.
Yeah, and
to say the least.
that's why you often see people have deathbed confessions. You know,
Mhm.
their guards are up
Mm-hmm.
their entire lives, and it's only at the last moment when they kind of are faced with their own mortality
Mm-hmm.
that they have to kind of look at things from a more of an objective kind of lens. And yeah, it's, you know, speaking to kind of how one would start these type of conversations, you know, I think that it's important to start it with some degree of humility,
Mm.
right? And when you approach this conversation with somebody, you know, Sikhism has a bunch of different mentions of like how to kind of go through life and, you know, with regards to other people and their morality, in saying, Hum nahi changa, bura nahi koi,
Mm.
that I am not good and nobody else is bad, right? Or saying that, you know,
Is that the complete quote? Does it end with like, but they sure are selfish though?
no,
Something like that.
it's not the entire shabad, but like, you know, it is the sentiment in that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, just saying that like there's also nako murak nako siana, that like murak is somebody who is like just you know, going based off of their mind's intentions and has no like overlying like morality or principles.
Mm.
So there is no murak and there is no siana. Siana is somebody who's wise, right?
Mm.
And so these kind of themes are repeated
Right.
to kind of remind the individual walking on the spiritual path that, you know, whether you're just going inward with your thoughts
Mm.
or you're actually actively engaging in dialogue with somebody,
Yeah.
you have to really approach it from a state of humility.
Mm-hmm.
And that allows you, like you said, to actually open with a more connected and emotional kind of perspective,
Yeah.
as opposed to a more punitive or
Mm-hmm.
morally kind of superior notion, right?
Right.
And
Right.
so, like, these are lessons that I've learned over time because I was an idiot in the way that I would kind of address these conversations in the past. And I would get argumentative very quickly.
Yeah.
And it's kind of you're pushing your notions of morality or ethics onto somebody else.
Right.
And, you know, the ability to engage in these conversations, even if you're trying to confront somebody about it, and still have this notion that, hey, they might present something new to me that should give me thought, should give me like a moment of, you know, perspective change potentially. That is, I think, very important. So humility and the ability to see that you might be engaging in this conversation,
Mm-hmm.
but you yourself also might be subject to some movement in your perspective.
Absolutely. That relates very much to something else. I'm really like plugging Jonathan's work hard right now.
No, that's what we were doing in this podcast. Right?
But he does quote in another one of his books on the work of John Stuart Mill, who said something very similar to that, which is that he who knows only his perspective knows little of that. Because if you only know your side of the argument, you
Yeah.
don't know of any alternatives, you can't even strongly argue for why you hold the position that you do.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why you need to know the alternatives. And for that, you need to have humility, the recognition that there's a lot more that you don't know than you do know.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting exercise, I think, to actually begin to reflect on this notion of like, what did I used to hold on to so tightly that now I regard as a foolish idea
Mm-hmm.
or that is wrong entirely?
Yeah.
I don't know about you. Did you ever get to crack open your time capsule from high school? Did you
No.
have one?
No.
Okay, I did. And actually, I still feel the same way I felt about what I wrote was my favorite album. I wrote The Fellowship of the Ring from The Lord of the Rings.
Interesting.
Yeah, that was my favorite soundtrack.
Wow. Is that
Um,
also Hans Zimmer? Or?
No, not Hans Zimmer. Howard Shore.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and Enya. Anyway, but like there's so many other ideas in that time capsule. I'm like, that's wrong as hell.
Yeah, I remember you back then. So.
Yeah, you remember me all too well. Yeah, he's still there. But there's so many components of what I thought about the world. Like, just as a really foolish example, I remember being like way too old at the time when I learned about this, but I learned about the concept of greenhouse gases. We all knew at a certain point, I might have been like 13 or 14 or something, again, too old. I learned about the concept, and like my initial thought when I heard about greenhouse gases was like, if we know they're bad, why don't we dismantle the greenhouses? Why are we yeah, right. So like way too old to have that thought, but it legitimately crossed my mind.
Yeah.
And obviously, like, I don't hold that anymore. And
Yeah.
so the sense should be, what do I currently hold that's complete nonsense or
Yeah.
totally unsubstantiated? I mean, that's the fun thing to me. When you start learning about heuristics, about cognition, you start to recognize that your beliefs that have like some translation to being accurate representation of what's in the world,
Mhm.
and your beliefs that are totally wrong, inside of here, they're identical to you.
Yeah.
You can't tell the difference.
Yeah.
It's very, very interesting exercise. But once you acknowledge that it's possible, then you can do as you described, which is you enter into a conversation knowing that the person you're talking to, however much you might think you disagree,
Mhm.
it's possible they see at least some part of this more accurately than you do.
Definitely. And we see it also kind of shown in the archetype of the hero and the hero's arc.
Mm-hmm.
That it involves a starting point. It involves some type of forced growth based on experiences or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that I think we get an opportunity to look at a lot more these days through social media. Social media will every once in a while, whether it's Facebook or whatever, it'll send you one of your previous posts, and you're
God,
just
I hate that.
yeah, and it's just a reminder of how sure of yourself you were in the
You
past.
stupid fuck.
Yeah,
What you thought.
that's what it feels like a lot of the times.
Yeah.
And
I
it's
know.
like
It doesn't feel at all like what do they think the reaction would be?
I think they like it might be. I don't know. It's the fact that I don't want to look down on individuals on social media because I'm on it myself. But I think they assume that it'll just give you a feeling of nostalgia.
Right, like when it has like the memory compilation they show you in your photos.
Yeah.
I don't understand the feeling of being like, hey, I know that guy. Like, it's not a positive feeling ever, unless it's of a cat or something I took a picture of.
The posts though, and I was an individual that used to post a lot on Facebook and just virtue signaling nonsense that was just so stupid and reductionist.
That's a fun topic too.
And the wording too, the wording that I used.
Right.
Like even down to the semantics of
Greta.
speech.
Yeah.
Just
But again, how could you know though? How could you know?
Yeah.
We are intensely social beings, for better or for worse, and I see that pattern everywhere too.
Can I respond to that question though? When you said, "How could you know?"
How could you know?
I think that we gotta stop saying that. But the fact that your social circles change over time,
And
the fact and there's a potential that if I had different social circles at that time, that I might have come to more mature conclusions or more mature kind of perspectives on things. And so when you ask how could I have known, if I had consciously surrounded myself with different people back then, then I might not have developed the concrete and kind of oversimplified notions that I had back then.
That is very interesting. It's making me wonder if you had grown up somewhere where you were surrounded with I don't know, the General Lee and Leonard Skinner, if like that had shown up more in your feed.
we grew up in Aldergrove,
We did.
right?
Well, you
And
did. I came through Surrey, and then so
yeah, but
yeah.
I mean, like, I technically decided the highway that my parents' farm was on is Langley,
Hmm.
but
You were on the other side of the highway.
yeah, very much, but it's like went to Poppy first, and then switched over to Aldergrove Community Secondary School,
Hmm.
and it definitely changed the way that I approach things. And when I would go to individual, or I would go to communities like Surrey or Abbotsford that are predominantly East Indian,
Hmm.
I always did feel like an outsider in a
Mm.
sense, just because growing up in Langley and stuff, it just gave me a circle of individuals that gave me a perspective very different from what individuals that grew up in Surrey or Abbotsford, or
Right.
we're talking about these cities, but it's cities that have are majority represented by one community,
Right.
right? And so
Right.
you can obviously apply that to anywhere in the world.
Hmm.
But consider myself lucky now that
Mm.
I grew up where I did. And, if I was in more of a homogenized community that
Right.
looked similar to mine, it might have been easier in some aspects. But through like the challenges that I encountered,
Hmm.
it actually caused a lot of inner work and inner dialogue.
Right.
And so
Right.
my argument would be that, I ended up actually benefiting from that.
Right. The fish doesn't know the water that it swims in, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But you were exposed
Yeah.
to
And
the other side.
I kind of interjected there
Hmm.
as you were talking. But yeah, I just feel that, that you can essentially have different outcomes based on who you surround yourself with.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a really good way to start closing. And I know I rushed over a lot of Haidt's work, and I strongly recommend the book The Righteous Mind. It's a really interesting and funny book, especially the opening and the taboos that he mentions right out of the gate. I don't want
Mhm.
to spoil it, but it definitely offends your sensibilities, which is kind of the point that he's trying to make about how you develop your moral intuitions. But getting closer to why I wanted to have this conversation in the first place, and what you had just described about having had the benefit of exposing yourself to like alternatives such that you know your position better, or you're able to kind of recognize the fluidity of your morality or sense of identity,
Mhm.
and how our social groups influence the kind of signals that we're starting to make, etc. Recognizing that flexibility. I know this is very cliche, and it's funny to me that saying things like, love is the answer is so cliche now that we don't like, it's almost offensive to say it. It's like, you're not sophisticated at all, and you're thinking if you think love is the answer, you know what I mean? Like, we're so done with that. But to me, I really do still feel that sense of the question of, can't we all just get along? And when I try and think about what that looks like, it does look like trying to start doing things that are not like our reaction for some of us is to fight the evil or to fight what we see as being wrong.
Yeah.
When if we start to understand ourselves, the composition of our thinking, our cognition, what we are as beings, then quickly we start to recognize that that very reaction is what continues this cycle. If I need to push back against something, then I need an enemy to do that. And even if no enemy exists, I will find a way to have you meet that description if we disagree on certain points.
Yeah.
I don't want to live in that world. I want to find ways where we can recognize each other as being what we really are,
Yeah.
which is we all, to me, essentially want the same things. I mean, there's exceptions being that people with really pronounced psychopathic traits and tendencies, they have little in the way of moral qualms, with some exceptions, even among that group, about harming people to get what they want. But even in that, there's nuances.
Yeah.
But for the most part, to me, the vast majority of people, we all want the same things. We might disagree about how to get them.
Mhm.
And I want us to be able to get along, not just because I don't want us to continue fighting, but because I think that's what we all ultimately want.
Yeah.
We don't want to live in a world that is constantly fraught, where we can't get our needs met, where we're constantly having to compete in this way. Like so many of the illnesses that we recognize in the West now, and I know there's obviously comparable examples in Eastern or sociocentric cultures. Um, a lot of disease or a lot of the disorders that are arising are the result of us living in ways that we know are out of alignment with ways that are consistent with being healthy human beings.
Yeah.
And that can easily spin off to a number of different discussions.
It's very difficult though to move in that way
Mm-hmm.
when you are in a state of heavy struggle,
Mm-hmm.
when you are worrying about your finances.
Yes.
And so that's something that I've kind of looked at like myself and in the past few years where my finances have gotten a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
My capacity for love and compassion, I feel, has increased.
Yeah, you can see further.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just, and that's where we push into kind of conspiracy, that these power structures kind of put us into situations where it's every man for themselves and that kind of thing, to keep us from feeling the state of compassion and feeling this state of love
Right.
that you kind of stressed. And so, that might not necessarily be true, but sometimes just an outcome of this, capitalist world that we live in, which is like really dog eat dog in a lot of ways. It's this state of competition with each other, right? And so it is, I find, difficult to come to these more mature ways of thinking when you, for one, are in a difficult, financial place or mental space as a result. And two, like if you actually, you don't necessarily have the ability to kind of identify with other people because you've been kind of sequestered into like these small communities, or you've been kind of put into a specific group, and you're made to be
Right. And your group membership is your sense of survival, and to think outside of that or to discover ideas that would make you someone who sticks out from the group would be like you would very quickly feel the real disadvantages within that group. Then it makes perfect sense. There, like as we mentioned in the beginning, your thinking is going to follow your intuitions, your reactive parts of your brain. And unless you're part of a cosmopolitan society, for example, that allows you to actually shift in multiple groups, it's a dangerous thing actually doing thinking that would set you apart from the group if you rely on them for survival, which many of us do. That's why people fight tooth and nail for group membership rather than allowing truth to lead them where it will ultimately lead. But on that note, I do think that injecting more understanding into the situation, not less, is still helpful. And I totally agree. I would acknowledge that it's much, much harder to think clearly if you are in a very tightly enmeshed group, in one that very, very strictly punishes individuals who stray and very highly rewards those that further endear themselves to the group.
We see this kind of stuff mentioned in Lord of the Flies and in Animal House, in terms of Animal Farm.
Right. Some are more equal than others. But even among like that, and I just think it's interesting to note around like being able to think more clearly when you have more money. I always come back to the idea that the brain is an expensive organ to run. It takes about a third of the calories that you take in a day. So literally, if you can't afford to eat as much or eat as like broad nutrition palate, you can't afford to think in that. But
there is a point of diminishing returns there too, right?
Yeah, for sure. If you can afford more food, you can afford more shit food. Definitely, it depends. But even among like the capitalist thing, I think that's a tricky one because in some sense, does it enable psychopaths more than maybe previous more collective arrangements do Potentially, yeah, I would agree with that. But does it also incentivize strangers to solve problems for strangers that they'd never meet? Yes, it does that too.
Yeah.
Anything that offers utility offers disadvantages. Just as the internet allows people to connect in ways they previously never connected, it also makes it a lot harder to check psychopathy because we can do anonymized reputational savaging now in
Yeah.
ways we never could before.
Yeah.
Um,
Demonizing capitalism, obviously, like it's overly simplistic,
I'm
right?
saying you took a cheap shot.
Yeah, and it's just, it might have been part of human development for a long time,
Yeah,
and it's definitely led to huge innovation, huge technology advancements, huge advancements in medicine.
and it's helped us to get to the most precarious point we've ever reached,
Yeah.
seemingly.
And the notion that I just tend to like come back to on capitalism is that it was a part of our growth, and it's not to say like that we have to throw it out entirely, but I think that a new system can be somewhat hybridized,
Right.
and
Right.
and so even in Canada we enjoy the
Mm-hmm.
benefits of that. We have a lot of social programs in terms of social medicine,
Yeah.
social welfare,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's something that I think humanity will move towards
Yeah.
more of a hybridized system over time.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's always best to not overly simplify these intensely complex like topics.
Yeah. But I
and to
agree
see
totally.
nuance, right?
Yeah, I agree totally. I do think that, like everything, even democracy is a delivery mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
The question is always, how can you increase the standard of living without removing the things that many of us take as being important, useful, necessary aspects of the way we live?
Yeah.
The idea that we're going to approach it with austerity is pretty ugly to most people. It's
Yeah.
like the whole Jimmy Carter just wear a sweater thing. Nobody went for that. But yeah, like just about every one of our conversations, it's really complicated. I know why we use a lot of these generalized terms, because it saves time.
Yeah.
The irony to me ultimately is that we fast is slow and slow is fast. Just as in survival, I think it's the same in conversation. If we're not prepared to actually very carefully go through our definitions, we're very quickly going to run into misunderstandings as a result of using language that we take for granted as meaning the same thing to one another when in fact it doesn't.
Yeah. Language is a limiting thing, right?
Yeah,
You know,
as
and-
much as it enables. Like
Yeah.
your world is only as big as your language in some sense.
And that's where if you get the opportunity to know more than one language, you see, there's certain things that are just lost in translation.
Yeah, and that
Yeah.
keeps me up at night.
Yeah.
But I do think it's worth visiting works of people like Jonathan Haidt. And if you don't want to read the book, you can always find the lectures. It's useful because I think it does expand the understanding. And if you do actually want to develop a practical means of reaching another person and living in a world where you don't have to be deathly afraid of the people that we live with on this planet,
Mm-hmm.
then we need, or disgusted by them, because that's a whole other thing,
Yeah.
then we do need to develop more understanding. And you don't even need to start that with a sense of like hoping to get to something closer to enlightenment or moral superiority. On a strictly practical level of wanting to live with more ease, with more knowledge, with more understanding, with more compassion,
Yeah.
more reason to engage, then it does start with developing that knowledge base around things like the underpinnings of our moral psychology.
Yeah.
I mean, there's many methods, but that's one that I think is doing a lot of heavy lifting.
Yeah, and we'll have to revisit this more in the future, just because it is such an expansive kind of thought train, and there's lots of thought experiments that go alongside it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it was great going at it today and trying to figure out how we stand on these things.
Definitely.
I do always end up actually, when we get really conversational and are able to flow well, I have different thoughts that just starts bringing up in my head. So it's, for me, I find it's a really big benefit to just have the time to have these conversations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I look forward to this always.
Likewise, man. Even just driving over here, the feeling was like, oh boy, I get to have one of these conversations.
Wow.
It's not like nose to the grindstone. I have to do this. No, it's so enjoyable. I hope those of you listening, really enjoy this process too. it is a process. It's going to continue to grow. We're going to continue to develop our fluency. I know that we've just reviewed before we started this podcast that we do still have a few verbal tics, like starting every sentence with "I think."
Yep.
Thank you for bearing with us. We're going to stop also being apologetic because that can get old too.
Absolutely.
But overall, I have a great time. I hope you've had a great time. Thank you, Zapier.
Likewise, man. We'll see you guys next time.
Take care.